If you enjoy uncovering the world's deepest mysteries, tap like and subscribe now. It's the easiest way to join our journey into the shadows. The July sun had been unrelenting all week, turning the streets of Detroit into a shimmering mirage of heat and exhaust fumes. On the afternoon of July 30th, 1975, the air seemed heavier than usual, as though it knew it was about to swallow a secret it would never give back. The man walking out of his modest suburban home that day was no stranger to secrets. James Riddle Hoffa, former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, stepped into the blinding light with the measured confidence of someone who had spent decades staring down senators, mobsters, and presidents. But even Jimmy Hoffa couldn't have guessed that in less than 2 hours, his name would vanish from the public eye, not into disgrace, but into one of America's most enduring mysteries. He wore a crisp white short-sleeved shirt, the collar neatly pressed, paired with dark slacks. His hair, slicked back in that familiar comb-over, was flecked with the silver of age, but his frame was still solid, his movements still deliberate. He had been a fighter all his life, not only for his Union men, but for his own survival. As he climbed into his maroon Pontiac Granville, he had an appointment. 2, actually. One was with an old ally turned rival, the other with fate itself. No one could have known that this was the last time anyone would see him alive. Detroit in the mid-70s was a city caught between glory and decay. The auto industry still roared, but the air was thick with the scent of burnt rubber and rusting steel. Labor unions still held sway, but the federal government was tightening its grip, and organized crime had long since embedded itself in the city's veins. Hoffa had once been the king of this world, the man who could summon a strike that would bring the trucking industry to its knees in a matter of hours. But in 1967, he'd been convicted of jury tampering, fraud, and conspiracy. A prison sentence had stripped him of power, and his release in 1971 came with an agreement brokered by none other than President Nixon. Hoffa would stay away from union affairs until 1980. For a man like Hoffa, that was a life sentence in itself. Staying away was never an option. He'd built the Teamsters from the ground up, forged alliances with mob bosses when necessary, and crushed rivals when they threatened him. Now he wanted back in, and he was willing to walk into the lion's den to make it happen. By 2:30 p.m., Hoffa pulled into the parking lot of the Machus Red Fox, an upscale restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a quiet suburb north of Detroit. The meeting was set for 2, but Hoffa was known for his punctuality and for keeping score when others weren't. His appointment was with Anthony Tony Gia Cologne, a feared Detroit mob captain, and Anthony Tony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters boss with ties to the Mafia. Both men had reason to distrust Hoffa, and Hoffa had reason to distrust them. The meeting was supposed to be about resolving differences and paving his way back into union leadership. Hoffa parked his car in a visible spot, locked it, and stepped out into the oppressive heat. He waited near the entrance, scanning the lot. Minutes ticked by. No Tony Jack, no Tony Pro. Hoffa's patience wore thin fast. He checked his watch, the gold catching a glint of sunlight, and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The parking lot was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic on Telegraph Road. Every so often, a car would pull in or out, but none carried the faces he expected. Hoffa was a man used to commanding a room. Standing around like a man left waiting was not in his nature. He stepped inside the air-conditioned dining room for a moment, exchanged a few words with staff, then returned to the parking lot. He scanned each passing vehicle, looking for something, anything familiar. The longer he waited, the more the meeting felt like a setup. In the distance, a green Mercury Marquis slowed down as it passed the lot, the driver's gaze fixed ahead. Hoffa didn't know it yet, but some witnesses would later recall seeing a similar car near the restaurant that afternoon, the kind of detail investigators would later obsess over. The car didn't stop, and Hoffa's eyes shifted back toward the main road. By 3:27 p.m., he was seen speaking to three men near his car. No one could confirm exactly who they were, but one witness, a truck driver passing by, swore he saw Hoffa get into a maroon car, different from his own. Another claimed to have spotted a man matching Hoffa's build sitting in the back seat as it pulled away. From that moment, Hoffa seemed to vanish into thin air.
But there was no thin air in Detroit. There were people, there were eyes, and there was the web of organized crime that had both elevated and endangered him. Giacalone and Provenzano later claimed they never met him that day, insisting they were miles away, engaged in alibis that police would later find difficult to break. Still, Hoffa's own son, James P. Hoffa, would later say his father had been lured to his death. The meeting was a trap from the beginning. Investigators quickly learned that Hoffa had made several calls from a payphone outside the restaurant, growing more agitated with each one. He called his wife, Josephine, telling her he'd been stood up. He called a friend, Louis Lintau, complaining about the no-shows. But between those calls and the sighting of him entering that unknown car, the timeline compressed into a narrow window, a gap of less than half an hour, where the fate of Jimmy Hoffa was sealed.
That evening, when Hoffa didn't come home, Josephine grew uneasy. By nightfall, worry hardened into fear. This was a man who valued loyalty above all else. Not showing up, not calling, it wasn't him. She reached out to family and friends, but no one had seen him since that afternoon. By midnight, the reality was sinking in. Jimmy Hoffa was missing, and no one knew where to start looking. The following day, police found Hoffa's car exactly where he'd left it, locked, untouched, no signs of a struggle. Inside were his personal belongings, still neatly arranged. To the casual observer, it was just a parked car. To investigators, it was the first sign of how clean and professional the job had been. If Hoffa had been taken, it was by men who knew how to make someone disappear without leaving a trace. The morning after Hoffa's disappearance, the Bloomfield Township Police Department was already feeling the weight of the case. Detectives stood in the Machus Red Fox parking lot, surveying the maroon Pontiac as if the car itself might whisper a clue. The heat had returned with a vengeance, pressing down on the blacktop, making the chrome shimmer like molten metal.
Hoffa's neatly locked vehicle was maddening. It looked as though its owner had simply stepped away for a moment, but the silence around it was absolute. Detective Sergeant John Boyle, leading the local investigation, knew immediately that this wasn't the kind of disappearance you solved with a few phone calls. Hoffa's name wasn't just big, it was radioactive. The former Teamsters president had enemies in Washington, rivals in the labor movement, and an entire rogues gallery in the underworld who might have wanted him gone. Boyle's gut told him this was no random crime. This was a surgical strike.
News of Hoffa's disappearance spread quickly. By midday, every major newspaper in Detroit was running headlines, and TV news anchors were repeating his name with a mix of shock and inevitability. To the public, Hoffa was more than a labor leader. He was a figure out of an American crime novel, the man who could make or break industries, the man rumored to have dined with mob bosses one day and the President of the United States the next. That such a man could vanish in broad daylight felt almost unthinkable. The FBI was pulled into the case almost immediately. Special Agent Andrew O'Brien, a veteran of organized crime investigations, was assigned to work alongside local authorities. The Bureau's interest was obvious. Hoffa wasn't just a missing person. He was a missing link in a chain of federal investigations into the Mafia, corruption, and labor racketeering. If Hoffa had been silenced, the question wasn't just by whom, but why now? Witness accounts began trickling in, though they were contradictory at best. Some swore they saw Hoffa pacing near the restaurant entrance long after his scheduled meeting time. Others recalled a mysterious green car, possibly a Mercury Marquis, circling the lot. A waitress at a nearby diner claimed she saw Hoffa get into a car with two other men, though she couldn't make out their faces. Every lead was a fragment, and none fit neatly into place. The FBI's first move was to dig into the men Hoffa was supposed to meet that day: Tony Giacalone and Tony Provenzano. Both were longtime associates, both had mob ties, and both had reasons to want Hoffa out of the way. Tony Pro, in particular, had a personal grudge. The two had once gotten into a heated shouting match in prison, reportedly over union pension funds, and the bad blood had never cooled. To understand what may have happened to Jimmy Hoffa that afternoon, you have to step into the invisible corridors of power that ran through Detroit in 1975. Corridors not built of brick and glass, but of favors, fear, and silent nods across smoky rooms. Tony Giacalone was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. In the Detroit mob, he was a capo, a captain, his authority unquestioned. Tony Provenzano, on the other hand, was known for his temper, quick to smile if you were useful, quick to turn if you crossed him. Hoffa had crossed him twice. In the weeks leading up to July 30th, Hoffa had been restless. Friends later recalled his conviction that the Teamsters, his Teamsters, were slipping away from him. Frank Fitzsimmons, his successor, had grown close to the mob, but not in the way Hoffa had been. To Hoffa, that meant weakness, a corruption of the balance he had once maintained. He began calling meetings, leaning on old allies, pressing for a return to power. But pressing the wrong people in this world didn't just get you sidelined, it could get you erased. Hoffa believed the meeting at the Machus Red Fox was his way back in, a chance to broker peace with Gia Cologne and Provenzano, to prove he could still command respect. But even before that afternoon, there were signs this was no friendly sit-down. On the morning of July 30th, Hoffa received a call from Gia Cologne confirming the meeting. The exact tone of that conversation is lost to history, but Hoffa's friend Louis Linteau would later recall that Hoffa seemed confident, overconfident perhaps. At 2 p.m., Hoffa arrived at the Red Fox. By 2:15, he was already making phone calls, first to Linteau, then to his wife, Josephine. His voice was clipped, annoyed. He had been stood up. Linteau advised him to wait a little longer, but Hoffa had already been watching the clock. He hated being late, and he hated being made to wait even more. Shortly after 3:20 p.m., a witness spotted Hoffa standing beside his maroon Pontiac, talking to 2, possibly 3 men. Their identities remain uncertain, though sketches based on vague descriptions would later circulate. Moments later, Hoffa was seen getting into a car that wasn't his. Whether he went willingly or was persuaded is a matter of debate. The car pulled away. No one, not the waitress at the nearby diner, not the passing truck driver, could follow where it went. That 20-minute gap between Hoffa's last phone call and the moment his trail went cold became the focal point of the investigation. For decades, law enforcement would try to fill in those minutes, to stitch together what happened after he stepped into that unknown vehicle. But in those minutes, the city swallowed him whole. The FBI wasted no time zeroing in on the men who might have orchestrated Hoffa's disappearance. Gia Cologne and Provenzano were the obvious starting points, but neither man flinched under questioning. They had airtight alibis, or so they claimed. Gia Cologne insisted he'd been at a health club getting a massage. Provenzano swore he was in New Jersey playing cards with trusted associates. Both produced witnesses. The Bureau noted the timing. These were not just alibis, they were prepared alibis. But in the world Hoffa inhabited, no one operated alone. The Bureau began quietly compiling a list of secondary figures, lower-profile mob associates who could be tasked with dirty work without drawing attention. One name surfaced repeatedly: Salvatore "Sallybugs" Briguglio, a Provenzano lieutenant known for his loyalty and his ruthlessness. Briguglio had been implicated in other contract killings, the kind where bodies vanished and questions went unanswered. Investigators believed that if Hoffa had been taken, it was done with speed and precision. Mob hits were rarely impulsive. They were planned down to the second. The likely scenario, agents theorized, was that Hoffa was convinced to get into the car by men he knew, possibly thinking they were taking him to the real meeting location. Inside the car, he would have been flanked on either side, boxed in. If he sensed betrayal, he wouldn't have gone quietly. Hoffa had fought his entire life, which meant whoever was in that car had to be capable of handling a struggle without drawing attention. Years later, mob insiders would suggest that Hoffa was driven to a nearby safe house, possibly in Detroit's northwest suburbs. There, in the confines of a garage or basement, the betrayal would have been made clear. Accounts differ on what happened next, but one detail remains constant. It was quick. A .22 caliber pistol fitted with a suppressor, a favorite of mob enforcers, would have left little noise, just enough to make sure the man who once commanded the Teamsters would never speak again. The challenge for the FBI wasn't just proving who had done it. It was proving anything at all. Without a body, a weapon, or a clear witness, the case was a labyrinth of hearsay and circumstantial evidence. Informants fed agents conflicting stories, each one more elaborate than the last. Some claimed Hoffa's body had been cremated within hours. Others swore he'd been buried under the foundations of a building, or even shipped in a steel drum to New Jersey. Every version was plausible, and every version lacked proof. The Bureau intensified surveillance on known mob hangouts in Detroit, but the underworld had already closed ranks. In that world, silence was survival. No one would be foolish enough to brag, and no one willing to trade Hoffa's fate for leniency. The risk was too great. Hoffa, in life, had been a man who understood leverage. In death, his very absence became the mob's greatest piece of leverage against the government. The first theory emerged almost immediately, whispered in the hallways of the FBI's Detroit office: cremation. The story went that Hoffa's body was taken to a mob-controlled funeral home within hours of his death. There, under the guise of routine business, the body was placed in a high-temperature crematorium and reduced to ash before sunrise. It was neat, it was final, and it left no trace. But the problem with this theory was access. The FBI could never definitively connect any funeral home employees to Hoffa's disappearance, and those in the business were as tight-lipped as the mobsters themselves. Another theory claimed Hoffa's remains had been buried at a construction site in Detroit, deep beneath freshly poured concrete. In the summer of 1975, the city was dotted with building projects, each one a potential grave. One particular site, a suburban home foundation, drew interest after an anonymous tip in the late 70s claimed Hoffa had been buried there before the cement was set. By the time authorities investigated, the concrete had hardened into an impenetrable slab, and the owners refused to allow a full excavation. Then came the most sensational claim of all, that Hoffa's body was shipped across state lines, encased in a 55-gallon steel drum. According to this version, the drum was loaded onto a truck bound for a Mafia-controlled landfill in New Jersey, or possibly a freight container headed overseas. One mob insider claimed the barrel was stacked in a shipping yard with hundreds of others, making it impossible to identify without tearing apart the entire yard. When questioned, the source smirked and said, "Let's just say he's not in Detroit anymore." But perhaps the most infamous theory was the Meadowlands rumor. In the 1980s, a prison informant told authorities that Hoffa was buried beneath what would later become Giant Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. The image was irresistible to the public imagination. The idea of the most famous missing man in America lying beneath the very field where NFL games were played. Over the years, this theory was largely debunked through ground-penetrating radar and later demolitions, but it never lost its grip on popular culture. The truth, if it was ever whispered, may have been more mundane and more brutal.
Some insiders suggested Hoffa's body was disposed of in an industrial incinerator used for waste oil, its intense heat obliterating bone and tissue alike. Others hinted at burial in one of Detroit's many rural outskirts, in a spot so nondescript it could never be found without explicit directions. What united all these theories was the deliberate absence of hard evidence. Each possibility had just enough plausibility to keep investigators chasing it for decades, and just enough uncertainty to keep the case unsolved. For the FBI, the sheer volume of conflicting accounts created a kind of investigative paralysis. Every lead had to be run down, but every run ended in a wall of silence. Hoffa had been a master of leverage in life, and in death his absence became the ultimate trump card, a mystery too valuable to resolve, a symbol of the mob's ability to strike in daylight and vanish without consequence.
By the early 1980s, the FBI had logged thousands of hours and hundreds of interviews chasing Hoffa's shadow. But cracks were beginning to appear in the mob's wall of silence. Not all of these cracks were out of loyalty to the law. Some were born from grudges, fear, or the shifting sands of underworld alliances. Men who had once kept their mouths shut were aging, serving long prison terms, or facing their own mortality. And when that happened, word started to leak. One of the most promising breaks came from Charles, or Chucky O'Brien, a longtime Hoffa associate who had practically been raised as Hoffa's foster son. O'Brien was spotted driving a maroon Mercury Marquis brougham on the day Hoffa vanished, the same kind of car several witnesses had described near the Red Fox. O'Brien swore the car wasn't his and that he had nothing to do with Hoffa's disappearance. But the FBI found traces of a scent in the trunk that police dogs reacted to, the scent of a human body. Forensic science in the 1970s wasn't precise enough to prove it was Hoffa's, and the lead slipped away.
Then came Frank Sheeran, the Irishman. In the late 1990s, Sheeran, a union official with mob ties, claimed in a deathbed confession that he had been the one to kill Hoffa. According to Sheeran, he lured Hoffa to a Detroit house under the pretense of a meeting, then shot him twice in the back of the head. Sheeran's story was immortalized years later in Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, but at the time, the FBI viewed his claim with skepticism. Sheeran provided details, but many conflicted with known facts, and no physical evidence supported his version. Yet, Sheeran's account carried a certain cold plausibility. He had been a close associate of Russell Bufalino, a powerful mob boss who allegedly ordered the hit. In Sheeran's telling, Bufalino feared Hoffa's return to power would reignite mob union tensions and attract too much heat from federal investigators. Eliminating Hoffa wasn't personal, it was business. By the early 2000s, another informant claimed Hoffa had been taken to a Detroit home owned by a mob associate named Carlo Licata. FBI teams excavated the property in 2004, tearing up the floorboards and searching the crawl space beneath. Nothing. The Bureau repeated this scene several times in the decades to follow, digging up driveways, fields, and garages based on credible tips, each time finding nothing but dirt and disappointment.
And then there was the chilling story from a mob soldier who claimed Hoffa's body had been placed in an oil drum and buried beneath a load of scrap metal in a Mafia-controlled landfill in Jersey City. In 2013, the FBI searched the site using ground-penetrating radar, but found no conclusive evidence. Every time the agents thought they were close, the trail dissolved into myth once more. It was the summer of 2006 when the FBI mounted what would become one of the largest and most public searches for Hoffa's body. The lead came from a convicted mob enforcer who claimed Hoffa had been buried beneath a barn on a horse farm in Milford Township, Michigan. The informant, speaking under immunity, insisted he had been told this by a trusted associate who was there when the burial happened. The farm had once been owned by a man tied to the Detroit mob. This time, the Bureau was certain they were on to something. For days, agents swarmed the property, digging with heavy machinery, combing the soil for human remains, and scanning the earth with radar. News helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting the dig to millions of viewers. The tension was electric. Each scoop of dirt could be the one that finally closed the case. When the excavator bucket clanged against something hard, everyone watching held their breath. But when the object was lifted into the sunlight, it was just an old piece of farm equipment. By the end of the search, the FBI announced they had found no evidence. Another lead, another dead end. The closest brush with the truth came in 2019, when an aging Mafia associate named Frank Coppola claimed on camera that he knew exactly where Hoffa was buried. According to Coppola, his father had been involved in the disposal and had shown him the spot decades earlier. The location? A specific section of a landfill in Jersey City, the same site where earlier rumors had placed Hoffa in a steel drum. Coppola described how the barrel containing Hoffa was buried 15 feet down, alongside several others, then covered with steel and dirt to ensure it would never be disturbed. The FBI took Coppola's claim seriously. In October 2021, agents returned to the landfill, drilling deep into the earth and extracting soil samples. The search lasted weeks, and for a moment, it felt as if half a century of questions might finally be answered. But in July 2022, the Bureau quietly announced the results: nothing. No remains, no drum, no proof. The case remained open, but the last credible lead had collapsed into the same hollow space that had swallowed all the others. Even now, the moment Hoffa stepped into that car outside the Machus Red Fox is like a frozen frame in American history. The faces of the men who may have been with him blur in and out of focus. The route they took fades into speculation, and the place where they ended his life remains hidden beneath layers of silence, loyalty, and fear. The mob's genius was not in how they killed Hoffa. It was in how they made him vanish so completely that decades of determined investigation, millions of dollars, and countless man-hours have done nothing but deepen the void. That is the enduring power of this story. The way it ends without ending, leaving everyone, from FBI agents to the public, staring at the same unanswered question. Somewhere, someone still alive knows exactly what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, and they are still not talking.